It's my pleasure today to introduce Professor John Ferris, Calgary, and also Center for Military and Strategic Studies. Professor Ferris is the author of 5 books and 420 articles and chapters in books in topics ranging from intelligence history to the book he will be discussing today is this one, and it's called The Authorized History of GCHQ, the Secret Cyber Intelligence Agency. Today's talk will be touching upon this book, the so-called 5 Eyes chapter, 5 Eyes, the Spy Alliance, Canada, parts of Australia, UK, US, and New Zealand. Professor Ferris will be shedding some light on the origins and development of a very new institution. I would call this book quite brilliant for many reasons, but I would mention 2. Have an official historian of anything or an event. And it was a great honor to have a Canadian historian write on what is probably one of the most powerful tools in the arsenal of the British state when it comes to security. So it is GCHQ who asked Professor Ferris to write its official history. So that's one reason. It's a powerful institution that remains and fully researched. And the other reason is that it's actually one of the best books on the 5 Eyes, even though the 5 Eyes doesn't go up in the title. And the 5 Eyes also is a very powerful institution that non-governmental network. And yes, powerful, fully understood and fully researched. So I should say that to Professor Ferris, beware, we have some budding experts on the 5 Eyes and on the future here at the GSPIA, so they'll be asking questions, but you'll have 45 minutes to your talk. And I'm very happy to see you here in person, given the weather. We're free to join me.
Thank you very much. Now, I started working in the history of signals intelligence in 1982. I was a PhD student doing a dissertation that was essentially on British strategic policy in the decade after the First World War. Purely by accident, I discovered that I was stumbling across SIGINT references all the time. And at that stage, people didn't believe you could find any material on signals intelligence in British record, because it was well known that the British government was trying to keep everything back. And when I would find things and show them to people, they would say to me either, so what? Or they'd say, well, okay, you found that, but you can't actually say anything meaningful about British signals intelligence. And I finally got annoyed and said, well, I will. And so partway through doing one PhD dissertation, I started another, which you could not get away with today, which I was able to get away with at that stage. Over the years, I treated signals intelligence as one of the things I worked in. And I was discovering things that people didn't believe were there. So for example, the First World War, I ended up being one of the first, in fact, the first modern historian who went through primary documents looking for how signals intelligence affected what armies did or what is happening at blockade. And although I didn't realize at the time, the articles I was writing were being read by people in Anglo-SIGINT agencies who were interested in history. So I had developed a kind of following both in the National Security Agency and in, without knowing it. And in the late 90s, first American and then British SIGINT people became open to talking to people who weren't government officials. And I found over time that I could develop a rapport with SIGINTers because I understood what they were doing and they knew that I did. Problem with their mission. In other words, I looked at what SIGINT is doing in the same way that I looked at what a Navy was doing. If the issue was SIGINT against foreign states, I never had any objection to it at all. And let me make it clear now, what I'm saying about SIGINT is focused on SIGINT as an external issue. I have very different feelings if you're talking about SIGINT used by a security service within your own borders. As far as I'm concerned, if you're dealing with foreigners, there are no limits. Read anything you can, bearing in mind that most of what you collect is going to be useless and it's going to get in the way. When it comes to dealing with signals intelligence and us as Canadian citizens, I believe that obviously we have to have real constraints on what the government can do. In any case, ultimately, by the early teens of this century, I was asked to write the authorized history of GCHQ. I said yes, in part because they were basically buying out my time from the U of C for 3 or 4 years, which meant that I could spend all my time doing what I really wanted. Now, in doing that, I ended up writing a very long book which talks about lots of issues, many of which are deeply technical, and if you don't want to read them, don't. I wrote the book for a series of audiences, one of which was people like you, one of which were professional SIGINTers that I wanted to show to them that I knew what I was talking about. And those are the chapters you may not want to look at. But also, I wanted to write for a common reader. In other words, just an intelligent person who was interested in things around them. Now, one of the things I ended up writing about was the 5 Eyes. And that's what I'm going to focus my attention on now for the next 40 minutes. Now, the term 5 Eyes was one which was not really commonly spoken until about 20 years ago. I remember the first time, in this particular instance, an American SIGINTer used the term 5 Eyes in front of me. I thought, what the hell are they talking about? It only really entered popular journalistic parlance about 5 years ago. What the 5 Eyes is not at all simple. One of the most important books on signals intelligence, the history of it, is by an historian named Rafe Bennett, who was talking about ultra in the Second World War. And what Rafe said is that there was not just one ultra, there were many ultras. In other words, the phenomenon changes fairly frequently over time, and you have to be cautious about generalizing. Well, the same thing is true in talking about the 5 Eyes. First of all, I, as an historian, regard the 5 Eyes as being essentially a SIGINT phenomenon. In other words, at the heart of the 5 Eyes is a relationship between SIGINT agencies of 5 different Anglo countries. On the other hand, I think it's legitimate to talk about 5 Eyes when you're referring to, say, relationships between human intelligence or security agencies. So Dennis Molinaro last year published a very good collection of articles that's essentially about security services in the Anglo countries during the early and middle Cold War. And he talks about it as being an example of 5 Eyes, and I'm not going to quibble about it. I think you can legitimately extend the idea of what the 5 Eyes are to a broader issue. But what I would really insist on is that in the end, what you're looking at is a psychological and strategic alignment. The fact of the matter is that our 5 Anglophone countries, Britain, Australia, Canada, the Kiwis, the Americans, fought in the Second World War, developed a strategic relationship with each other that's never entirely evaporated. There's much more trust between our governments than there is between any of us and any foreign state. Our military forces are used to cooperating, and there are really no fundamental political disagreements between our people. That's not to say that we're perfect. That's not to say that we don't make mistakes. It's just to say that if we make a mistake, we all tend to make it at the same time. So although I will focus primarily on the SIGINT relationship, I'm aware of these other nuances, and I'll talk about them briefly in order to show some of the borders to what I'm discussing with SIGINT. Now, the 5 Eyes relationship as a whole emerges essentially in 1940-41. With the fall of France, when the British Commonwealth is fighting alone against the German Italians, the Japanese potentially entering the war, And the Americans scared stiff of what will happen if the British Empire vanishes. You actually have to go through American records to see how afraid they are. There are staff plans which say, if the Germans take over the Royal Navy, how many months would it take for German sailors to be able to make efficient use of British battleships? American planners are saying, what happens if the British go under and we have to confront an alliance between Germany, Japan, Russia, and Italy? So the Americans are really concerned, and by the way, so are the British, and so are we, about the circumstances we're in. Now, in that context, long before the Americans enter the war, the British and Americans enter a kind of quasi-alliance discussion, which might have been deemed illegal by Franklin Delano Roosevelt's opponents in American politics, and they might be right. When I've gone through the record, there are moments when I say to myself, you know, boy, the American government has ceased to be a neutral at this point without the American system of decision-making and agreeing about that. But one of the things that happens is that the British and Americans slowly begin to show what they have to each other. August of 1940, the British send an important mission to Washington, which essentially gives key military technology to the Americans. They give the Americans all of their work in radar. They give the Americans all of their work with cavity magnetrons, which are a very important source of exploding things, for free, because they want to show the Americans that they're a serious power that is not going to simply collapse. And in this context, American and British decision makers agree that they should allow their signals intelligence authorities to talk to each other. And what they essentially say to their SIGINT authorities is talk to each other, see what you think is the right thing to do. The American senior authorities simply say to the Navy and Army codebreakers they have, talk to them. The British government says to their SIGINTers, talk to them, but don't let them know what we're doing against the German Enigma system. For a simple reason. The British are just beginning to learn how to break Enigma. They're scared stiff of insecurity in DC, and believe me, history shows they were right to be scared stiff of insecurity in DC. But essentially what happens is the American Navy and Army send a small team of professional codebreakers to Britain to talk to their British counterparts. After a long trip on an American battleship and then a British cruiser, they end up at Bletchley Park. In February 1941, they come in like midnight. There's a sherry reception for them. They're very happy to do it. They're taken off to stay in a very, very pleasant country home. And then they enter negotiations with the Brits. Now, the negotiations are handled from our perspective in a genuinely weird way. Day one, British and Americans are sitting down. The American Army says, let us show you something. And they put on this table a huge machine that's about as long as both of these tables together, which is a purple replica. In other words, it is the electronic system the Americans have come up with, which duplicates the logic of the Japanese diplomatic cipher machine, which the Americans call purple. The product they call magic. And what the Americans are basically saying to the British is, look, this shows you what we can do. Brits for free, just like the Brits had given radar to the Americans for free. Now, this is not the way you normally negotiate. I can't quite figure out what the Americans are doing. I think it's because the Army Security Agency knows that the Brits exist. They know they're good. Because in fact, they had just figured out how the Zimmerman telegram had been produced and how it had worked in 1917. And when they looked at that, they thought, well, the Brits back then were pretty smart. Maybe they are too. Now, what then happens is a series of negotiations over a couple of weeks where the Americans and Brits basically put most of their cards on the table except for Enigma. And what the British quickly realized is that the purple replica is a brilliant issue. It shows how good these people can be. On the other hand, when it comes to anything else, the Americans are not in our league. But the Americans are a rich neutral with big industrial resources, and if we could work with them, it would be a good idea. Now, the question is, do you tell them about Enigma? Do you tell them about your ability to break it? And essentially what happens is that a senior, if you like, getting away from the very top decision makers in British codebreaking, a man named John Tiltman is one of the most senior people. And Tiltman essentially says within I'll just call it GCHQ and forget about name changes, says within GCHQ, this cannot work if we don't show the Americans what we have. If they have any reason to mistrust us and believe that we haven't been as frank to them as they've been to us, this relationship cannot survive. And the heads of GCHQ finally say, look, you go talk to the head of British intelligence. You have him talk to Winston. And that's exactly what Tiltman does. And one of the things about GCHQ in the Second World War is that you have these middle-level technicians who are willing to talk directly to people like Churchill and go straight to him and say, look, sir, if you want something to happen, this is what you have to give us in order to do it. There is no other agency in, I'd say, the Anglo-American decision-making nexus of the Second World War that has the chutzpah of GCHQ, in part because they do have a product people want and they understand how it has to work. So Tiltman convinces Stuart Menzies, who's the head of British intelligence, and then Churchill to give the Americans access to what the British are doing against Enigma. Now, the British have been afraid that if you give any information to the Americans, it might well come out in the New York Times, which is a valid concern. So what happens is Tiltman then says to the American visitors, there are moments in your life when you have to do things without any authorization. And the chief army officer says to him, I'll be happy to tell that to my general. But in the end, these Americans agree that they will be briefed on what the British have got and will promise only to talk to their superior when they get back home. So the British show their bombs, in other words, the machine they've built to break Enigma. They give the drawings to the Americans so that they can manufacture their own. What they can't hand over is the software. So in other words, the British have built machines that can give you a means to break through brute force into German cipher machines. But of course, the way you do that requires a lot of skill, mathematical ability, and that the British can't simply pass over to the Americans. Now, I'm going to speed through my discussion of the Second World War. You could lecture on intelligence in the Second World War forever, but take us through what really matters. In the course of the period from 1941 to 1945, SIGINT becomes a fundamental source of intelligence for the British and American, which senior British and American leaders love. They just adore this stuff. There's never a moment when anybody says, we shouldn't pay attention to this. As soon as they see it, every Anglo-American, and by the way, German commander says, boy, give me more of this. So it's something that people really like. Although they don't have to allocate the same level of resources to the matter as they do to the Manhattan Project, nonetheless, Ultra and the Manhattan Project are the two top priorities for strategic investments of the Anglo-American alliance. GCHQ remains superior to the Americans. And indeed, when the United States sends its top codebreakers to Britain in 1943 to observe how GCHQ functions, they send back messages saying, these people are amazing. They're doing things we haven't even considered. 2 Brits can generate as much material as 20 of our people can do. They're just staggered by the quality. And American commanders become used to relying on Ultra, which means they're relying on the Brits. SIGINT authorities aren't thrilled by this. They would rather they got the kudos, but they can't do the work. And this leads us toward the end of the war. Now, in the course of the war, there are lots of clashes between British and American SIGINTers, like there are British and American authorities in any aspect of the war. The difference being that SIGINT is the only area where the British remain superior to the Americans all the way through the war. Indeed, they remain superior up until the early 60s. It's only around the early 60s that the Americans are able, unit per unit, to get up to British levels of quality. There are lots of disagreements. If you look at how British liaison officers in SIGINT sent to the United States respond to Americans in 1942, they're just driven crazy. There's a famous anecdote, which I'm glad to say I included in my book, of the chief of American Army Signals Intelligence standing in front of a urinal on Boxing Day 1942, doing his business at the same time as he's damning British officers for getting in his face. But the important thing is that the Brits and Americans do this on the side. They don't ever conflict with each other with the bitterness that they express occasionally on the side. And as time goes by, they get to trust each other, partly because they fought these bitter battles without access. And very often, these are really fundamental battles about who's going to do what. And by the end of the war, the British and Americans are starting to think in different terms than they had during it. As the war ends, they start to say, okay, the Germans and Japanese are down. What is our next problem going to be? And it's self-evident. The next problem is going to be the Soviet Union. Now, independently, by the end of 1944, both GCHQ and American naval codebreakers start to turn their attention toward the Russians. And in 1945, as British SIGINTers no longer have to attack German circuits, they're assigned to do what's called general search, which means you're looking for communication circuits you don't know anything about. You're trying to identify them, who they are, etc. And the British, of course, are focusing on Soviet targets, because the only targets on Earth they haven't been attacking up to that point are Soviet targets. So by definition, if you're going after a new target, they're Soviet ones. And in strict terms of logic, the dilemma that the Americans and British are confronting is this. We're SIGINTers. We believe that signals intelligence is going to happen all the time. Do we work with the other against the Russians? Which means we both concentrate our resources against the same target, or do we decide not to cooperate? In which case, we're not merely foregoing cooperation and what that will produce. We're also confronting a new enemy. We're going to create a new enemy. We'll divide ourselves. So there's a real logic for the wartime alliance and SIGINT to continue. And essentially, by the spring of 45, the British and American SIGINTers are both internally saying, all right, we should find out if our governments will authorize us to talk to each other. And their governments do. In the British case, you can't document whether the British Prime Minister says yes, but given the way the British system works, obviously he did. In the American case, we know exactly what Harry Truman says. Harry Truman is told by his military advisors, by the chiefs of staff, cooperation with GCHQ is fundamental to American national interests. Period. That's what they're saying. They're saying the danger is of a nuclear Pearl Harbor. If we're going to hold off a nuclear Pearl Harbor, we need the best intelligence we have. And in our experience, that means we must cooperate with the Brits. Period. Now, what cooperation will mean under this American diktat is not quite clear, but nonetheless, it's very clearly enunciated to Truman that if you want to protect American national security, you need to cooperate with the Brits. In London, the British authorities essentially delegate to the head of GCHQ the task of reaching an arrangement with the Americans. This is the single most important quasi-diplomatic instrument British sign, I would say, in the 20th century that is not handled by the Foreign Office. Because Neither the British nor American governments are willing in formal terms to be involved in this discussion. They don't want a formal treaty. In fact, they know they can't get one. Because a formal treaty will mean the American Senate will have to be informed of what the treaty is, and they'll have to be informed of why. And under the best of circumstances, the executive branch is unlikely to treat the Senate as being a particularly secure place to do this sort of thing. And I have to tell you, the politics in the United States were as virulent then as they are today. So the end result is that the British and American authorities allow SIGINT professionals to negotiate what becomes UCUSA, which is the core of the Five Eyes. In other words, UK USA, but it's simply abbreviated as the acronym UCUSA. What works essentially is a British team is sent to DC. They negotiate with the Americans. The British team is entirely composed of SIGINTers, and they represent the SIGINT agencies. The American Army delegation is almost essentially SIGINTers. The American Navy delegation are normal American naval officers and signals officers with their code breakers in a very minor position. And there are conflicts of interest between the three groups. Without going into huge details, GCHQ and the British and the American Army code breakers, both of whom had a civilian core, had worked together very closely on the war. And they'd reached accommodations during the war, which represented the way you had to work. And so, in fact, the British and the American Army have similar ideas about what they want a future SIGINT relationship to be. The American Navy is much more tough-minded. What it really wants is an arrangement whereby it can strip the Brits of all of their technical gains and then walk away for free. And I don't blame the American Navy for adopting this position. That's what I would do too. The interesting thing is that the British and the American Army don't adopt this approach because they've seen how cooperation is preferable to this sort of transactional relationship. The end result is a secret arrangement which is not a formal treaty, which then regulates a relationship between the SIGINT agencies of the British and Americans, and later on, other members of the Commonwealth. The arrangement is original at the time, then it proves to be, in fact, in the sense that none of the parties are perfectly happy with the technicalities of the agreement they reach. But they're all willing to see if it can work. And as time goes by, essentially what happens is the American Navy's opposition to some elements of it vanishes because the Americans unify SIGINT with British encouragement. And essentially that means that the Army Security Agency dominates the new National Security Agency. And what then emerges is a period of testing how these things will work. Now, what are the elements of the agreement called UCUSA? Well, there are lots of them, one of which is you don't attack each other's traffic. You're bound to intercept traffic because if you're dealing with high-frequency radio, anytime you have a radio interception capability, you're going to pick up your friend's communication, but you won't attack it. You agree that you will pool your resources in pursuit of common efforts. Some of the pooling can involve interdependence. And from the very beginning, UCUSA actually involves the British and Americans, or the Canadians and Americans, working together against the same target. So in other words, you can't easily tell where Canadians start or stop and where Americans stop or start. You share your technical advances, even ones which may not pay off in the short term. So to give you an example of how this works later on, in the middle 1950s, the NSA is able to really start to computerize cryptanalysis because the Americans developed the world's most powerful computing industry, which is heavily reliant on cryptanalytic purchases. Take away cryptanalytical organizations as a market, and the development of the American computing industry would have been much, much delayed. And there's a certain point in the mid-1950s when the British begin to fear that they're going to be left behind. But NSA finds a way to provide supercomputers to GCHQ, because essentially what it says is GCHQ is actually better than we are, and is actually the first head of NSA, General Kanine says, all I needed to do was give them a UNIVAC computer and they could solve my problem. So he thought that this was working in his favor. The Brits thought, holy crap, we're getting a supercomputer. But essentially what it means is that you can find ways to combine their capability. Now, the limits are that both the British and Americans agree that they will decide whether certain specific instances are going to be handled by them alone. Classic example, the British give the Americans nothing about the ultra troubles. Another classic example, when the British are dealing with the end of the Palestine Mandate, they won't give the Americans access to their SIGINT. And later on, when the Americans have a SIGINT relationship with Israel, the Americans won't give the Brits direct access to what they're getting from Israeli SIGINT, which is good, by the way, fairly early age. But they essentially agree that they will share product more or less totally. And they both agree that if any one of them comes up with a major technical advance, they will share it, even if the exploitation is going to be a decade down the line, unless it is clearly something they regard as important, in which case they have to tell the other what they're not going to provide information on and what. Now, as it turns out, actually, these limits to UCUSA don't really matter a huge amount. There are all sorts of things the British and Americans and Canadians don't share, but generally speaking, the overwhelming majority of their product is shared. Now, the other area about UCUSA that's complicated are people like us or the Australians. Now, you have to remember that in 1944, Australia and Canada are both deeply involved in SIGINT work in the Second World War. Canada controls one sector of the Battle of the Atlantic, and the British and Americans refused to let us take it over until we could demonstrate that we had a SIGINT capability that could handle the work. Now, what happens with the Dominions is complicated. The British initially believe that they can bring the Canadians with them into UCUSA. And the key sticking point is whether the Americans and Canadians can contact each other directly. The British try to say, no, it all has to go through us. And the Canadians and Americans say, forget it. At which point, the British lose the ability to shape how the Dominions can be brought in because they're screwed up. On the other hand, the British look back and they say, well, if the Canadians are a pain in the ass to us, let's let the Americans deal with it. And in fact, what happens is the Americans find it extremely painful to negotiate with Canada in the 1940s over how the Canadians will enter UCUSA. But the weird thing is that there's never a moment when Canada is not involved in cooperating with the British and Americans. It's just that we're cooperating without any formal arrangement to explain why we're cooperating. And ultimately, an organization emerges which is called CANUCUS, CAN, UK, USA, which is the most important, I would say, diplomatic arrangement Canada's involved in, and you've never heard of it because nobody talks about it. But essentially what happens is that Canadians have access to Anglo-American SIGINT, and they have to contribute to the pot. One of the unspoken rules about UCUSA is you can't draw from the pot unless you contribute to the pot, which I have to say makes perfect sense to me. But we go on cooperating with both of them for years before CANUCUS emerges. Why CANUCUS matters is because it means that in NATO, 3 of the 5 eyes work together. In NATO, the three Five Eyes do not, and I repeat, do not share almost anything they get in SIGINT with any European member of the organization, which I think actually creates major structural problems. I personally have said and have written that if a war had broken out, NATO SIGINT would have collapsed, because you have an arrangement where essentially, for example, the commander of the Central Front in NATO is always either French or German. He never gets SIGINT from the Five Eyes. But if he happens to have a Canadian or British or American deputy, that man is getting SIGINT. And somehow you're going to have to find a way when a crisis emerges to give the French or German commander access to SIGINT. Personally, I don't think it could have functioned. So one of the problems with the emergence of the Five Eyes is that you're actually handicapping NATO in purely military terms. Now, the Australians come in even later because there is good reason on the basis of Western SIGINT to believe the Soviets had penetrated the Australian government. They had. The Australian government refuses point blank to address the issue, period. The Americans then say to the British, we will cut off all ties with you, including Yakuza, if you give any help to the Australians in intelligence. And ultimately, the only solution comes when the British essentially send an MI5 liaison team to Australia, which helps to reconstruct Australian security intelligence. And it becomes involved in some of the most horrible politics among the Five Eyes countries. If you want to ask me about it, feel free. But finally, at a certain point, Australia is brought on board and the Kiwis come in because everybody likes them. The Kiwis don't have much to offer, but they're a friendly nation. And so everybody says, bring them on board. And that also means in the 1980s, when New Zealand refuses to allow visits from any ship that might be carrying nuclear weapons, and the Americans break off all other ties with the New Zealanders over it, there's still a SIGINT relationship. All the other Four Eyes decide that they are going to continue to cooperate loosely with the Kiwis, even though they're the only members of the Five Eyes doing it. There's a real resistance on part of the members of the Five Eyes to break with each other on the SIGINT side. How the Cold War and SIGINT work, I would say that from the point of view of the five members, it's a great decision. For a country like Canada, which is trying to demonstrate its significance to other great powers, and which under Lester Pearson at least is very interested in the SIGINT product. Lester Pearson, in fact, is one of the world's most experienced people in terms of dealing with SIGINT in the 1950s. Even by 1942, GCHQ regards Mike Pearson as being the Canadian to talk to if there is any problem in terms of liaison. Later on, I'm not convinced the Canadian governments care very much. But nonetheless, if you're involved in the Five Eyes, it means you have connections with people who matter in American decision-making. So Canada ends up, for example, building this massive SIGINT capability in alert, which in technical terms is hellishly difficult to create. And the fact that we've done it, and you have people living in 40 below temperature producing all of this SIGINT material, does impress everybody else in the Five Eyes. For a country like the United States, it essentially means that about 40% in the 50s and early 60s of your SIGINT product comes from the British, the Australians, and Canadians. And because the Brits remain very, very good in things like cryptanalysis and things like linguistic expertise, the Americans are very happy to work with them. General Kanine, whom I've mentioned, at one point, I'm talking to American official historians in the mid-60s, says, you know, the Brits could produce 3 times as much material as we did with half our resources. And he then says it's primarily because of the way our consumers demand that we produce material. But nonetheless, the Americans view the connection as being productive. If you're looking at why it matters in terms of policies of state, well, I would argue that what SIGINT does in the Cold War for the American side and also loosely for NATO, and probably for the Soviets, although we just can't document it one way or the other. What it does is allow you every day to say to your consumers and superiors, World War III will not break out tomorrow. You're providing a great deal of certainty that the kind of tense peace you live in is going to continue and not be followed by a great war. And there are moments when you get really important things. This is now on the very edge of what I'm allowed to talk about. And during the 6-day war between Israel and its Arab neighbors, GCHQ gives NSA material, which it gives Robert McNamara, who is the Secretary of State for Defense, material on Soviet policy in the Middle East. And McNamara says, this justifies NSA's entire budget for the year. I mean, you're providing material which people take very seriously. Beyond that, there are lots of things where the evidence is kept away from us. In many cases, I think with good reason. If you're looking at diplomatic cryptanalysis, well, the Five Eyes read everybody's communications they can. They read the communications of every neutral. They read the communications of their allies. They're reading French, German, Italian communications, Japanese. And I'd also say, let me tell you that every country does this. That's the way SIGINT works. To imagine that there is any serious power which is deliberately deciding not to try to read your communications is to be very naive. So when the Snowden material came out in 2013, I spoke about lots of German statesmen who were interviewed saying, we would never try to read American communication. They were trying to read Angela Merkel's cell phone communication. That's terrible. Well, a few years ago, German newspapers showed how, in fact, the Germans have been trying to read Obama's cell phone communication. The only problem being they couldn't do it. But to imagine that there's a situation in which only a couple of terrible countries do SIGINT is to really misconstrue the way all of this works. If you're a major power, you use it. How does it work? Well, my own sense, looking purely at things in the public sources, is that if you're looking at negotiations between members of the Five Eyes and other Western countries, it's all about diplomatic issues. It's primarily about economic issues. If you can find a way to gather information from another side that lets you improve your bargaining position on, say, tariff negotiations, you do it. It's just the way it goes. So up until the end of the Cold War, from the point of view of members of UKUSA, it's a success story. As I've said earlier, the real damage lies with NATO, where I have no doubt but that the existence of the Five Eyes weakens NATO SIGINT. Essentially, for example, the Germans are often much less good in their collection or interpretation of SIGINT than the British or Americans are. The Five Eyes can't sit down in detail and say, look, you're wrong, and this is why you're wrong. So you're actually not being a particularly good ally under those circumstances. Now, when we get to the end of the Cold War, lots of things happen. Communication nodes move from being focused on high-frequency radio toward the internet. On the internet, you suddenly no longer have distinct, specialized military communication systems, which you know are purely military. If you're going to go after communications on the internet, no legal system in the West is actually set up to deal with the realities of how you do it. All legal systems are based on the assumption that internal communications, like mail or landline phones, can only be intercepted by people within your territory, and essentially only if your government allows them to. Whereas if you're listening to high frequency radio, it's all going to be from foreigners. So you can have two sets of rules at home, highly restrictive access toward interception, which by the way, I like. And abroad is a free-for-all. The way the internet works essentially is that every packet of information goes via the cheapest route from point A to point B, which means that if you are intercepting communications in Canada, you might be intercepting communications from Russian intelligence in Petersburg to Russian intelligence in Moscow. It may also mean that if you're intercepting communications abroad, that you are inadvertently listening to somebody in Saskatoon phoning somebody in Halifax. So there is not a single legal regime in the West, which today or any time in the past 30 years, which in fact corresponds to the reality of how SIGINT works. And I have not actually seen any proposals from anyone anywhere, which I think come close to the simplicity and effect of the old system. The internet happens, the way you collect and process SIGINT changes, targets, time goes by. Now, under those circumstances, what happens in the 90s is that the Five Eyes continue. There's a lot of inertia behind them. All of them decline in size to some degree or another. And then 9/11 happens. And suddenly 9/11 creates a new environment which goes on to the present day. I'm not saying that the targets are identical. The initial targets are Al-Qaeda. Then they somehow mutate to Iraq. We end up with the Taliban. And then lo and behold, we're dealing with the Russians in Ukraine. And we're dealing with the potential of China in the Pacific. But under those circumstances, the value of cooperation within the Five Eyes is clearly exemplified. You can see why you need to cooperate with people. Now, the British, who had been in relative decline compared to the Americans in the late Cold War, actually pull up their socks, and they're able to get to terms with internet-based SIGINT faster than the Americans do. If you look at the Snowden disclosures, which are largely correct, although you need to be careful because it is not clear that every single product that Snowden releases actually did come from NSA or GCHQ. It is possible, and it's hard to prove, that some of them are not authentic. But most of them, I think, are actually quite correct. I wasn't allowed to say this in the history because NSA and GCHQ are unwilling to openly say that the Snowden disclosures were correct, even though their governments have said so. But it's true. But if you look at the Snowden disclosures, it becomes clear that what you're looking at are professionals who are trying to handle a new environment and doing it very well, but also very intrusively. Suddenly, the way the internet operates means that GCHQ or NSA can locate an individual who is worth paying attention to from their point of view, and that can be anybody using the internet. So things become extremely problematic. Now, in this context, the other thing that happens is relationships between the second parties, and second party is the term that's used to refer to all of the five members of the Five Eyes, and their relationships with third parties, which is to say anybody else, starts to change. In the Cold War, there had been moments when members of the Five Eyes share information with each other on major issues. The basic theory of the Five Eyes is that you allow easy exchange over very simple issues, allow exchange on more sophisticated issues with people who are friendly, who demonstrate the technical capabilities to get somewhere. And here the key thing is enciphered call signs. So the Soviets and every military on Earth comes up with means to encipher the call signs for radio systems. The techniques here become extremely elaborate and complicated. And Ukuza simply adopts the approach that if a foreign friendly SIGINT agency on their own can figure out how to break into enciphered Soviet call signs, then we will cooperate with them on basic forms of traffic analysis. Traffic analysis essentially means you're not able to read messages, but you're able to look at the external features of communication from which you can reconstruct things ranging from order of battle of an enemy army to the personal relationships between terrorists. What it's worth, modern SIGINT actually relies more on traffic analysis than it does on cryptanalysis, i.e. breaking enciphered communication. Well, the dilemma also is, if we are confronting problems, are there other third parties that are confronting problems? If we can provide solutions, are there third parties that can provide solutions? And what becomes clear is that the French and Germans are confronting the same problems as we are when it comes to terrorism or being involved in war in Afghanistan. It becomes clear that we could help them by giving them access to our databases and our data retrieval systems. And it would help us if they gave us access to their databases. We're now entering an area where European governments are extremely embarrassed because the governments themselves say we'll never cooperate with Five Eyes in terms of allowing access to our databases. In fact, many of them have, in return for being given access to our databases and our search mechanisms. But they won't admit easily that it happened. And so what occurs increasingly in the modern period is that the radical distinction between the Five Eyes and everybody else becomes less radical. In Afghanistan, for example, you have every belligerent involved in intelligence sharing. Generally speaking, the Five Eyes do insist on freezing out anybody, but it creates real complications and it creates a lot of outrage. If you look at Ukraine today, in fact, we are providing Ukrainians with SIGINT, and it's not just us, the Finns, the Baltics, the Poles, the French, the Germans, everybody is giving Ukraine SIGINT advice in the system. We're actually giving Ukraine access to what would once have been Category 3 SIGINT, i.e. communications text, mostly because we can pick up a huge amount from plain language Russian use of cell phones. And the Ukrainians are pretty good at this too, not surprisingly, and they have far more Russian linguists than the SIGINTers of any other country on earth except Russia, working in their favor. But in essence, the old rules by which the Five Eyes don't share things have broken down to some degree. And I would also say, if you look at, let's say, the crisis that's emerging in the Northeast Pacific with Japanese rearmament, Russian and Chinese expansion, and there's no question, Chinese provocation. The Chinese are really pushing their weight around. Well, one of the issues that's emerging is that the Japanese are now fundamental to American policy in the Northeast Pacific. But how can you make this work against Chinese and Russian submarines unless there is a SIGINT sharing relationship? The only example I can find like this is the so-called maritime strategy at the end of the Cold War, where the American and British navies essentially prepare to operate within the White Sea in order to attack Soviet nuclear submarines that have retreated to the White Sea rather than risking themselves on the high Atlantic. I would say that it's almost inevitable that the Americans are going to have to provide the Japanese lots of access to SIGINT. And in fact, I was speaking in a distance conference based in Tokyo last September. And what I essentially said to my Japanese audience, who were Japanese military officials, is, you know what, the Americans are very sophisticated. If you want to impress them, build a SIGINT capability and start attacking their traffic. And after they see that you're capable of doing it, they'll treat you seriously. So what I would say here is that the way the Five Eyes worked during the Cold War may not be the way that it continues working in the future. And my final point, the existence of the Five Eyes in Yakuza is one of the most secretive elements of the Cold War. It really wasn't until 14 years ago that the British and Americans actually allowed to be published their surviving documentation from the negotiations that lead to Yakuza. Really, nobody seriously thought about the Five Eyes as a factor in world politics much before 2000. We just didn't know how the SIG-INT relationship worked. Now we do. But having said that, that SIG-INT relationship has changed. The nature of the Five Eyes and their relations with other major powers is different. And there's one final point. The Five Eyes relationship worked because there was sufficient commonality between the interests of its members. They were confronting threats. Sometimes they were at war. They were willing to say, well, you know, we can trust each other because we have a long history of standing together and a long history of not sniping each other in the back. But I can tell you that British and American SIG-INTers are far from convinced that the Five Eyes are going to go on necessarily for much longer. Certainly 5 or 10 years ago, you could talk to people who would say, well, you know, I'm not convinced that the younger generation actually feels the kind of loyalty to the other countries that my generation felt. And if that's the case, I'm not convinced that the Five Eyes can continue. My point would be that although Canadians don't know it, we've gained a huge amount from being in the Five Eyes. We've got a lot of material, very cheap. It's helped us maintain our credibility as an ally. And to some degree, it's helped us achieve our national interests. If the Five Eyes go, the questions you have to consider, among others, are how do we deal with the United States? You know, one of the advantages of the Five Eyes is the Americans don't come after us. If the Five Eyes vanish, what are we going to expect the Americans to do, and what are we going to do about it? So I would actually say that there are lots of issues stemming from these technical matters, which are going to be live matters for our politics for quite a long time. So I'm happy to talk or answer any questions anyone might have. Thank you.
It's wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
To see a story and work. No PowerPoint. Well done. So let's open it up for
some questions. Starting with Steve.
I'll start us.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could. Okay, good. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on how sort of the military-civilian relationship would have worked, because during World War II, wouldn't basically all of the SIG-INTers in Canada, especially, have been military, but now CSC isn't. So,
now that's a very good question, and a lot of what happens in SIG-INT history can only be understood if you think sociologically. Now, I don't know how many of you have any military experience, but if you are institutionalized through a military service, you come out a different person than you started. And there are both strengths and weaknesses to this. Now, if you are creating a SIG-INT agency based purely on military people, you're getting the strengths of the military approach, but you're not getting the strengths of the civilian approach. The United States Navy's SIG-INTers in the Second World War are primarily all naval officers, whereas almost everybody working in GCHQ and most of the people working in the Army Security Agency are civilians who often are given temporary military rank, but they're not essentially military people. Now, the difference, if you were to look at, say, the Army Security Agency and the United States Navy's SIGINT agency are, naval officers are all, or sorry, naval SIGINTers are all naval officers, and they have a fairly high level of anti-Semitism. If you look at Army Security Agency people, almost everybody is a civilian, and a striking proportion of them are Jews. And I'm actually willing to say that one of the sort of subliminal factors that's at work later on is because the Army Security Agency people have had much better treatment from the Brits than they've had from American naval officers. And in fact, there's all sorts of personal relationships that emerge between SIGINTers, where somebody likes each other, and that tends to create, at this period, a national policy. But in any case, the distinction between civilians and military people was important then, and it remains important all the way through the Cold War, and it still is important. NSA is essentially a head-on collision between military people and civilians. The civilians are there permanently, and they tend to dominate the agency. But NSA is part of the Department of Defense, and the head of NSA is always, nowadays, a 4-star. Used to be 3, but it's now 4 stars, so it's a very important place to go. Whereas GCHQ is essentially civilian. There are a small number of military people. In the Canadian context, CSE is essentially a group of civilian analysts and military collectors. And there are cultural clashes between them. But these sorts of things, or, who is actually a SIGINTer, how many women are involved, how do you deal with ethnic minorities? These suddenly become issues which shape how a SIGINT agency works. But, those are things which have been historically hard to bring out because the agencies have been so opaque, they haven't allowed access to their history. But they are doing it now, and you can start to get answers to the question.
Some pie charts at the end. That address some of these questions. There was a hand up.
Sorry, we had another question right here.
So you spoke a little bit about the cultural aspects, but also, a little bit about technology and how the relationships change or have changed since the Cold War. So do you think there are any disadvantages to Five Eyes being formed of only Anglophone cultures? Does it affect how we collect, target, interpret intelligence? Or we've surpassed any barriers because the technology have evolved so far and we collaborate?
First of all, you're absolutely right. If you choose a group of people to cooperate and also define a group you won't cooperate with, you are by definition skewing every aspect of the organization. And historically, in say 1939, there's no reason to believe that the French are not particularly good in SIGINT. The Germans are actually good. And in the Cold War, if the politics had been different, I have no doubt that we would have gained from cooperation with the French or the Germans. But on the other hand, I also have to tell you that German security sucks during the Cold War. And if the Germans had known anything about the Five Eyes, so too would East Berlin, and so too would have Moscow. So the degree to which you can trust other people really does affect what you're doing. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I spent a lot of time in the book trying to define sociologically who these people are. And the good news about the Five Eyes is that it means that at least there's some diversity in analysis provided by one national group to another. So the Brits are much less reflexively anti-Soviet when it comes to analytical things than Americans are. I'm talking essentially about intelligence and military organization. And because the British have a good record in DC, if you're knowing what they're talking about, this actually means that the Americans, in the core of thinking about their power politics, are paying attention to people who offer less wildly hostile views of the Soviet. But there's no question that if you were able to choose different partners, or if the agencies could choose different people, that they would be different organizations producing different results. For what it's worth, this may sound strange. If you're looking at every organization I know of in modern history, NSA is actually the most progressive socially, because NSA leaders come to realize that if you work with certain groups, I'll give an example, that you can gain from it. So in the 1950s, as American SIGINT takes off, they're desperately looking for people who know how to handle data processing. Well, as it turns out, historically Black colleges are producing lots of African Americans who do know how to data process. And what happens is that after Truman declares the end of segregation in the military, NSA then starts to hire lots of African Americans to run portions of their work. And in essence, what happens is if you have a 24-hour, 3-shift structure, one of those shifts, and it's usually the one with the graveyard duty, is composed entirely of African Americans, including African American officers. So you're actually providing a means for African Americans to work in SIGINT. Bizarrely enough, in the mid-50s, General Kenine starts to explicitly order promotion boards to give women equal opportunities to men. And it's not because Kenine is a ravenous liberal. It's because Kenine is a manager saying, look, we really have a lack of bright people in our business. I need the best people I can get. I know that some women have proven that they're good at it. So therefore, I'm not going to allow this organization not to treat women as suitable candidates. GCHQ does not do that in the 50s and 60s, and neither does CSE. But NSA does. And NSA ends up with a woman who becomes de facto the head of NSA around 1980. Succeeded later on by another one. So, organizations can have different approaches toward diversity. And I also agree that diversity is an important way for SIGINT agencies to work. So GCHQ these days deliberately hires some proportion of its people from people who are on the autistic spectrum. Because what they say essentially is, autism means that you think about things in a different way than most people do, and that input is worth paying attention. But, historically, if you go back from any existing SIGINT agency from today and look in their history, you'll find all sorts of things that sound horrifying. So I write about a color bar that GCHQ imposes in the 50s and 60s and 70s because it doesn't want Black, Chinese, South Asian people serving. And that color bar doesn't really vanish until sometime in the 80s. I don't know when. But you could look at any security or intelligence organization at that time, and you're going to see that their behavior is one that we would regard with horror today.
Does it work? Cool. Hi. Well, thanks for your talk first. Just a quick question. You expanded a little bit, said bottom line, Five Eyes is good for Canada, has a lot of benefits. Just want to flip it a little bit. Do you see any cost? You highlighted, of course, modern communication, but other than that, do you see any cost for Canada or Britain to be part of, as any cost that Effective Canada is part of Five Eyes?
If you don't like the fundamentals of Canadian policy, then you are bound to say that you don't like the Five Eyes. And that doesn't bother me, by the way. If somebody sits down and says to me, I think that Canada would be better off being neutral than working with Western countries, in principle, I'm willing to say, sure, let's talk about it. I personally think that it's very difficult to imagine Canada being able to pursue an independent policy in the world. And when it's attempted to do so, it fails. In the late 40s, the Canadian government tries desperately to behave as an independent power and pursue an independent policy from the Americans in particular, but also the Brits. And the problem is we can't get it. Whereas once we cooperate in creating NATO, oddly enough, suddenly our influence in the West broadly improved. So I am convinced that from the position of Canada and Britain, yes, there are costs, but across the board that we gain more than we do. But there's no question that somebody who had a radically different idea of what Canada should do could easily say, no, we don't want to be involved in American hegemony. And let us be frank, if you are cooperating with NATO or working with the Americans in our position, we are supporting an American hegemony. It's called things what they are. But from our perspective, I would argue we're better off being a respected member of an hegemony than being an outsider attempting to get our way when other countries are simply going to do what they've done with Britain since Brexit. I mean, the Brits were stupid enough to walk away from the sweetheart deal that they had built up over 30 years of hard work. They removed themselves from the EU, their economy is tanking, and nobody cares. Why should they? You know, the Brits are the ones who screwed themselves. Nobody else should be expected to rescue them. If we were to walk away from the Five Eyes, as against the Five Eyes just disintegrating, we would get no compassion from anyone else. You know, although you have to be involved in seeing Canadian involvement with, let us say, U.S. military and intelligence people to see how it works. In my experience, one of the most sympathetic toward Canadian interests groups of any American decision makers are American military officers. Because as a rule, they have some experience with Canadian forces. As a rule, they like working with them because they think they're well-disposed and competent. I have been the only civilian in a room where the heads of Canadian and United States SIGINT, I mean the very top, are sitting down and talking. And you know, every senior American can talk about the National Hockey League. And in fact, there are lots of people in NSA who follow the National Hockey League. So we're in a position where we have lots of ins that we've acquired through lots of years of work. We don't provide enough to the pots to make our partners happy. And that's a deliberate decision on the part of the Canadian government, which chooses to get access at the minimum possible cost. It's probably the best way to phrase it. And so far it's worked out. So I am personally convinced that we would lose a lot that we don't know about if we were to walk away from cooperation with the United States and more broadly with NATO. If we decided that we wanted to do it, then by definition, we're also saying goodbye to the Five Eyes. And I would simply say under those circumstances, you need to ask yourself, how do you protect your government communications from the United States and Britain? Because if we were the ones to walk away from the Five Eyes, we are voluntarily making ourselves a target. Who wants to be like the French and Germans and have your communication ravaged by the most powerful SIGINT alliance that exists?
Question.
Hi, thank you for your talk and for informing us so much. You touched about this a little bit, but on the internet and technology change and the way that private citizens now communicate through the same systems as governments and militaries, how does the Canadian government or Canadians in general, how do we continue to navigate the new guidelines, I suppose, of navigating that intersection now?
This is actually, personally, this is one of the issues that I think is most important for our population, and we don't pay enough attention to it. I am very old-fashioned in the sense that I don't believe my government should read my communication without going through a legal process that provides some limit to government overreach. At the same time, we live in a world where there are lots of unpleasant people who'd like to do us harm. And the problem is that with the internet, it is harder than it used to be to define areas where we say our government will not behave badly toward us and say we're going to do whatever we need to do with potential threats. Before the internet, essentially every mode of communications within Canada could only be intercepted by the Canadian government. So postal services and landline telephone. Unless the Canadian government authorizes somebody to intercept mail or telephone, nobody can pick up your communications. Whereas if you looked at telecommunications, satellite communications, radio communications from abroad, sure. It's possible that some Canadian communications are there, but most of what you're going to be getting will be foreign communication. And under those circumstances, which is what our laws are set out to address, you can draw a radical distinction between what your government can do at home to you and what your government can do to protect you or to simply gather intelligence on other people. Unfortunately, with the way the internet operates now, that's not the case. Now, specifically, the problem that emerges is, how do you authorize anyone to touch my communication, right? Now, in the old days, it was possible for you to say, okay, the government is in a position to intercept any of my communications, but they shouldn't be able to do it unless there's a judicial warrant. Now, by the way, for what it's worth, in Canada from the late 40s until the early 60s, in fact, the federal government was in a position without having to talk to any legal authorities to tap anybody's telephone. Weird as it might sound, the way they read legislation indicates the government could unilaterally tap anybody's phone. I have found over the course of my work that laws about intercepting telephone communications are much more lax than they are regarding telegraph or postal communications. The British, Americans, and Canadians all at various times simply let their governments at their discretion intercept people's phones. But now if you were to look at how do you intercept communications, let me outline two legal doctrines and then talk about how it works in effect. One, which is put forward by internet libertarians, says that no government should be able to touch my communications at all, period, unless they have a judicial warrant. Now, the dilemma is that there are like 80 billion telecommunications events per day in, say, a country like Britain. We're talking about huge amounts of communications. And if I'm trying to intercept communication and cannot touch anything that might be Canadian, that means I can't intercept a bloody thing because I cannot know without touching it whether there is a Canadian IP address. So if you were to follow that line, in fact, what you're doing is preventing our SIGINT from working while the Russians and Chinese and every criminal are going to go on doing whatever they want. Now, the alternative, which is what, with some reluctance, I accept, because it's still kind of messy, is that you should allow your SIGINTers to touch what they call metadata. Metadata simply is a form of data. In other words, there are computer scientists who I know who would say, there's no such thing as metadata. It's all data. There's a point to it. But if you allow people to touch metadata, which essentially tells you nothing about the material you're dealing with, except telling you the IP address, basically, then you are at least ensuring that if somebody touches the metadata, it's simply as though they've looked up your telephone number in an old-fashioned telephone number. The data you're getting from metadata used to be publicly available in telephone books across the world. You know, you could buy all kinds of telephone books where they had already commercialized the equivalent of metadata. They'd have your address, they'd have your telephone number, they'd have your name, right? Well, metadata doesn't tell you it doesn't tell anybody your name. It just says this IP address has sent out this message, and it is in contact with the following IP addresses. And if you say, wait a minute, one of those IP addresses we know is a terrorist, I'm just pointing an example of that, then you have good reason to say, okay, I want to know more about that original IP address. And then the issue is, if you find it's Canadian, what do you do? At that point, my answer is, if you find that there's a Canadian IP address, contact with a suspect abroad, you need a judicial warrant to do anything else, but at least you now know that there might be a problem. But that in turn lets you actually collect SIGINT on the rest of the world. Now, the real reason why I never lose sleep over the idea of my government reading my communications is that I know how many telecommunications events there are on Earth. And the real limit to SIGINT is not the ability to intercept communications. The Americans and the British have worked out systems by which you can store billions of telecommunications events broken down into metadata for a couple of days. Now you have to flush the material after a couple of days because otherwise you can't bring in new material to interrogate. The real issue is when you have to spend cryptanalytic resources breaking into an enciphered system. And even more, the real expense is when you have to have a real human being read the content. Now, the only thing that could change this is artificial intelligence. I actually think that it might be possible using the most advanced forms of AI that I know of. And you've probably all heard of this chat IGT thing, which I fooled around on to see how it works. I believe it's possible that you could find ways to make AI help you skim through text and say, this is crap, but this you need to look at. But the real limit to SIGINT is the fact that you need an analyst who's using his or her time to read messaging and try to make sense of it. So for those reasons, the math means that I'm not worried about my government reading my communications because why should they give it? Right? There's nothing that I have ever said in anything which I would really care if my government did. It's not to say nobody should care because they're good people, they wouldn't be attacked. What I'm really saying is the math means that it is impossible in a country like Canada or Western liberal democracies as a whole to be able to have a government behaving like Orwell in 1984. But I would also say that we need to be aware of the potential danger of an Orwellian outcome, which is part of why I say we have to keep strong restrictions about allowing the government to actually attempt to read my messages as against touching the metadata and saying, oops, he's Canadian, we don't know who he is, but let's go somewhere else. But for what it's worth, these are major issues, and there's never been a good debate in Canada on them. The Americans and the British have had more mature debates. So have the Germans. And they've come up with different solutions. But there is no one in Canada who has sat down and had the kind of debate I'm talking about, where you would take, that group in Toronto, which I admire very much. Citizen Left, great people, but they're naive in the sense of not understanding the fact that we're living in a world where, in fact, there are unpleasant people who would like to be a threat to Canada or to individual Canadians. But to sit down and have debates between people with their technical skills and people who've got a different way of looking at things, I believe is very important to Canadians, because these issues touch on matters of our liberty and who we are. And I'm not, even though you can see I'm hard-headed, I have real sympathy for people who stand in favor of a constitutional approach, because that's part of how I view it too.
Question? You don't have time.
Hi, thank you for the talk. You're saying that the young generation might not be value the cooperation of Five Eyes as much as the old generation. And I was thinking, you're saying that, and that's the reason why Five Eyes might not go ahead, do the same thing as it used to be. Do you think there is another factor besides the young generation's valuation? Is the shift of international politics? Does that matter with this Five Eyes?
Yes. I mean, for example, if you were to look at the period after the American-led invasion of Iraq, there's no question in my mind that a large number of people in Britain, Australia, and Canada at that point would have said, we're really much less happy with the idea of cooperating with the United States than our parents were. I'd also say that when I look at the, to my mind, astonishing response of Western populations to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it seems suddenly out of the blue, people are saying, gee, the Russians are a problem, they're a threat. You know, it's the Finns and the Swedes who spent past century doing their best to avoid being dragged into power politics now want to join NATO. So it may well be that Russian behavior in Ukraine has changed what younger people think in the same way that Iraq did. But, you know, these are generational issues. I grew up, born in 1956, I grew up with the Cold War. I wasn't a Cold Warrior, although in terms of internal politics, I've always been a mushy liberal stroke, small c conservative. So for me, the idea that, you know, the world is filled with tough people and you have to take firm steps to protect yourself is very normal. To my children, that's not necessarily the case. And if people of my children's generation have different attitudes toward what Canadian national interests are, I just say they're wrong. I can't. So it's mostly a matter of talking about generational change. And I will say that my own guess would be that probably there has been a change in attitudes toward these issues in Canada and Britain, and a willingness to be more tough-minded and hard-headed than would have been the case, say, 2 years ago. Yeah, I mean, to assume that any popular idea of what national interest should be will continue on forever isn't really accurate. That's all I was saying about the Five Eyes. And I included it in my book because I thought it was an important observation for people to think about. Simply to believe that this relationship will continue forever is unlikely. And simply because I personally think that the outcome has been good for Canadians does not mean that other people should sit down and say you're wrong. Right? That doesn't bother me in the least. But, you know, in a way, we're like hobbits who've lived, you know, in a world where we're protected by people we don't know who are there. And suddenly we're confronting the things which our friends have been keeping away from us. That's how I view what's going on. And for us hobbits to suddenly sit down and say, well, you know, how do we protect ourselves is an important thing to ask. But I'm also fully aware that there are lots of academics who would disagree with me on my idea of what values should be. And I'm presenting an account to you of how the Five Eyes work, or SIGINT works, which is intended to be accurate. You can use SIGINT to produce the nicest outcomes you like. If you were trying to come up with a treaty that would restrict the use of armed force, you could use SIGINT as a means to achieve your ends. You know, there's no reason why liberal internationalists can't use SIGINT to achieve their ends the same way anybody else does. I think it's harder to achieve liberal internationalist ends than it is to achieve realist ends. But there's no reason why SIGINT can't help you do it. understanding how SIGINT works, I think, is important for anyone thinking about power policy. I started out thinking when we started working in the area, I originally thought to myself, I'm working in a really technical area, and what I'm doing is trying to explain how it is that governments acquire information that affect how they act. And about 15 years ago, I suddenly started to realize that, in fact, I was dealing with an issue that's become central to all of our lives. I mean, whether you like it or not, you're all caught up in SIGINT. If you spend your life on social media, or if you spend your life dealing with anything to do with the internet, you're a potential target. The biggest threat to any of us from so-called cyber issues are cyber criminals. Far and away, the biggest problem for all of us. And if there's a single person in this room who has not run up against somebody trying to steal your information for criminal purposes, please raise your hand. It happens to me all the time. And I'm talking about doing things like trying to price CDs and somehow ending up on a internet address that is .ru. And before I'm able to get out of it, suddenly I'm hit by something. And the way we all operate on social media, I don't, but I'm talking about you guys. Well, the standard approach is that you're providing a huge amount of information about yourself. You're advertising for yourself, and that makes perfect sense. There are theories of economics which talk about how one calls lemons. If you want to get a market for lemons, if you're trying, in other words, to buy a good used car instead of a bad used car, how do you do it? Well, 30 years ago, economists were talking about this, and they predict what people do on social media. You send out signals making it plain you're interested in something, you're looking for something, you show enough material about yourself that you can attract somebody into contact. And because people live their lives nowadays, by definition, you're making yourself vulnerable to anybody with SIGINT capabilities. And in the old days, the only people with SIGINT capabilities were attached to governments. Now there are millions of people with SIGINT capabilities. And you run into a lot of them all the time. Cyber war is one of these things which is really often the extreme, although it certainly could be argued that it's happened. But cyber criminality, something that you're all going to have to confront. People who behave like trolls, well, in a way, what they're doing is using a social media system to blacken your name in the form of subversion. So when I say that you're caught up in SIGINT, I mean that literally, in a way which was not possible before about 25 years ago. You as normal individuals are now in a competition where foreign governments or foreign actors can treat your communications as though you're a SIGINT target. And if you're not careful, they can actually make your life unpleasant.